The auctioneer's gavel slammed down with a resounding crack, echoing through the courthouse steps. Sold. His voice rang out, final and irreversible. Jordan Carter's world tilted as reality sank in. His home, his sanctuary, was gone. A bead of sweat slid down his temple despite the crisp autumn air. He turned, searching for answers, but all he found was her. Cynthia Whitmore, standing smugly in her designer trench coat, arms crossed, a cruel smirk tugging at her lips. "Looks like you should have paid your bills on time," she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. Jordan clenched his fists, his pulse roaring in his ears. He had done everything right, worked tirelessly, made every payment. But Cynthia, his neighbor and self-appointed nemesis, had used a legal loophole and a few well-placed phone calls to have his house seized over a clerical error. She had planned this, watched him struggle, and when the moment was right, she struck. As the new buyer signed the paperwork, Jordan felt his chest tighten. His father had built that house with his own hands. His mother's laughter still lingered in the walls. And now, in just 10 minutes, it was gone. But then, a voice cut through the crowd, stopping everything. The auction wasn't over yet, and karma was about to hit back. Jordan Carter had always believed that hard work and perseverance would lead to security. He had built his life on that principle, carrying the lessons of his late father, a man who had poured his sweat into every brick of the modest but beautiful home Jordan now lived in. It wasn't just a house. It was a legacy, a reminder of the sacrifices his parents had made to give him a better life. Nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the house stood strong, a two-story craftsman with a wraparound porch and a garden his mother had lovingly tended before she passed. Every inch of it told a story. The creaky floorboards in the hallway where Jordan had raced toy cars as a kid. The sunlit kitchen where his mother used to hum Motown classics while making Sunday dinner. The backyard where his father taught him how to swing a hammer. The smell of sawdust and fresh earth still lingering in his memory. Now, at 34, Jordan had built a solid career as a contractor, running his own small but respectable business. He had spent years renovating other people's homes while holding onto the one his father had left him. Life wasn't easy, especially being a black man navigating a field where he constantly had to prove himself. But he did what needed to be done. Bills were tight, but he made every payment. Or at least he thought he had. Across the street, Cynthia Whitmore watched with a sharp, predatory gaze. A wealthy, well-connected woman in her 50s, Cynthia had made it clear from day one that she saw Jordan as an outsider in her pristine, old-money neighborhood. From the way she wrinkled her nose at him during HOA meetings to the thinly veiled remarks about keeping up property values, she had made her stance clear. She didn't want him there. She had power, more than she should have. A member of the city's zoning board and close friends with the mayor, she had connections in places that mattered. And when she discovered a technicality, a minor clerical error in Jordan's property tax records, she wasted no time exploiting it. Instead of allowing Jordan to correct the mistake, she pulled strings, fast-tracking the foreclosure process before he even knew what was happening. Jordan had tried to fight. He had pleaded with the city, presented his proof, but the system moved fast when the right hands were greased. Now, in just a matter of weeks, the home his father had built was up for auction. And Cynthia? She stood there with a triumphant smirk, ready to watch everything Jordan had worked for slip through his fingers. But what neither of them knew was that fate, or karma, was about to turn the tables. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, plain white envelope, no return address, just his name in cold, typed letters. Jordan nearly tossed it in the pile of junk mail, but something about it made his stomach clench. When he tore it open, his eyes skimmed the contents, and his pulse stopped. Notice of tax delinquency and property seizure. His hands gripped the paper, so tight it crinkled. This had to be a mistake. A terrible, impossible mistake. Jordan had paid his taxes. Every single one. He grabbed his laptop, logging into the county website, his fingers shaking as he scrolled through records. And then he saw it. A clerical error. One missed payment. Not because he hadn't paid, but because the system had misfiled it. A glitch. A damn technicality. But that didn't matter now, because his home had already been flagged for foreclosure. And unless he could pay an outrageous penalty by the end of the month, His father's house would be auctioned off. His breath came fast, his heartbeat pounding against his ribs. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not like this. The next morning, he stormed into the county office, documents in hand. The woman at the front desk barely looked up as she tapped at her keyboard. "There's been a mistake," Jordan said, placing his papers on the counter. "I paid. Look, I have proof." She glanced at the papers, unimpressed. "You'll need to file an appeal, sir. How long does that take?" She clicked her tongue. "About 6 months." Jordan stiffened. 6 months? The auction is in 3 weeks. She shrugged. "I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do." There was someone who could do something, though. Someone who had likely set this entire thing in motion. Cynthia Whitmore. Jordan turned, storming out of the office, his fists clenched. He knew Cynthia had influence in city planning. Knew she had connections. But would she really go this far? The answer came 2 days later, when he saw her chatting casually with a city official at a cafe downtown, laughing over cappuccinos. Jordan's stomach twisted. This wasn't an accident. She had engineered this. That night, he sat at his kitchen table, staring at the foreclosure notice. He had 3 weeks to come up with a sum of money that he did not have. His business had been slow, his savings thin. Every call to the city hit a dead end. And across the street, Cynthia watched from her front porch, smiling. She thought she had won. She had no idea Jordan wasn't going down without a fight. Jordan had 20 days. 20 days to save his home. Every morning, he woke with a knot in his stomach. The house, his father's sweat, his mother's love, his entire childhood, stood solid around him. But the walls suddenly felt fragile, as if they could crumble at any moment. The foreclosure notice sat on his kitchen table, an unbearable reminder that time was slipping away. Step 1. Find the money. Jordan ran his contracting business alone, doing renovations, repairs, and odd jobs around the city. But winter was approaching, and work had slowed to a trickle. He reached out to past clients, offered discounts, and even took on grueling overnight shifts on construction sites. The long hours left him exhausted, but sleep wasn't an option. Not when Cynthia was counting down the days to the auction with a smug grin across the street. One evening, after finishing a repair job for an elderly couple, Jordan sat on their porch steps, rubbing the soreness from his hands. Mrs. Patel, the homeowner, brought him a cup of tea and sat beside him. "You look tired, Beta," she said, concern in her soft brown eyes. Jordan exhaled, running a hand over his face. "Just dealing with some things." She studied him for a moment before nodding. "You helped us when we had that plumbing disaster last year, and you wouldn't take extra pay. Let me help you now." His chest tightened. "I appreciate it, but I can't take charity." Mrs. Patel smiled knowingly. "Sometimes, the people who give the most are the ones who refuse help. But let me tell you something, Jordan. Pride won't keep a roof over your head." Her words lingered long after he left. He needed help, but asking for it, that was harder than any job he'd ever done. Setback after setback. Jordan reached out to banks for a loan. Denied. His credit wasn't bad, but it wasn't good enough for the amount he needed. He called legal aid. They couldn't expedite the appeal. The city wouldn't budge. He even tried reasoning with Cynthia. He found her at the country club one afternoon, lounging on the patio with a cocktail in hand. "You did this," he said, standing over her table, his voice tight with controlled anger. Cynthia took a slow sip of her drink unfazed. "You should have paid closer attention to your finances." Jordan's fists clenched. "You pulled strings to speed up the foreclosure." "I know it." She set down her glass, tilting her head. "And what are you going to do about it?" His breath came sharp and fast. He wanted to yell, to shake her, to make her understand what she was taking from him. But Cynthia Whitmore had never known struggle. She had never fought for something only to have it stolen right out from under her. She wouldn't help him. She wanted him gone. Hope in unexpected places. That night, Jordan sat in his truck outside his house, the weight of failure pressing down on him. The auction was less than 2 weeks away, and he was nowhere close to saving his home. A knock on the window startled him. He turned to see Sam Reynolds, his best friend since high school, grinning at him. "You look like hell." Jordan let out a dry chuckle. "Feel worse." Sam climbed into the passenger seat. "I heard about what's happening. Why didn't you tell me?" Jordan sighed. Didn't want to drag anyone else into it. Sam shook his head. You're not alone, man. We grew up together in that house. Your dad taught me how to fix a broken fence there, remember? Jordan looked away. He remembered. He remembered how his father had always welcomed Sam like another son, how they had spent summer nights on the porch talking about their futures. Sam pulled out his phone. I have some savings. Not a lot, but I can pitch in, and we're getting the guys together. Remember everyone from the old neighborhood? They're in. We'll do whatever it takes. Jordan swallowed hard. He wasn't alone. A community rises. The next week was a blur. Word spread fast, and soon the entire neighborhood was pitching in. Sam organized a fundraiser, using social media to rally support. Mr. Alvarez, a retired carpenter, offered Jordan extra work helping him with holiday renovations. A few old friends pooled together small donations, each apologizing that it wasn't more. But to Jordan it meant everything. Even his past clients stepped up. Mrs. Patel called her entire book club, and suddenly, Jordan had more job offers than he could handle. For the first time in weeks, hope flickered inside him. The final blow. With 5 days left, Jordan ran the numbers. He was still short. Even with the extra work, the donations, and every penny he could scrape together, he didn't have enough to stop the auction. That night, he sat on his porch, staring at the house. His father's house. His home. Cynthia must have sensed his desperation because she chose that moment to stroll over. "Tick-tock," she said, smiling like a cat with a trapped mouse. "I'll be at the auction, front row. Can't wait to see who buys it." Jordan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, because she wasn't worth the energy. There had to be a way out. As he sat in the quiet, thinking of every possible move, his phone buzzed. An unknown number. He almost ignored it, but something told him to pick up. "Mr. Carter?" A deep voice came through the line. "My name is Daniel Harrington. I saw your story online. I think I can help." Jordan sat up straight. "Who are you?" "A lawyer," the man said, "and I specialize in cases exactly like yours." Hope rushed through him. The fight wasn't over yet. The day of the auction arrived. Jordan stood on the courthouse steps, his hands clenched into fists. The autumn air was crisp, but his skin burned with adrenaline. A small crowd had gathered, neighbors, friends, people who had supported him. Among them, Sam and Mrs. Patel gave him encouraging nods. And then there was Cynthia. She stood near the front, arms crossed, wearing that same smug expression. Today was her victory. She had orchestrated this downfall, pushed every legal loophole in her favor, and now she was here to watch it happen. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "We'll begin with property number 3417, Maplewood Drive." Jordan's chest tightened. That was his house. His father's house. The bidding started low, a predatory game played by investors eager to flip and resell. Cynthia didn't bid. She was waiting, watching, enjoying every moment. And then, a voice cut through the crowd. "I object to this auction." A murmur rippled through the audience as a man in a sharp navy suit stepped forward. Daniel Harrington, the lawyer who had called Jordan just days ago. The auctioneer frowned. "Sir, this is a legal proceeding, and I have a legal injunction." Harrington pulled out a thick folder and handed it to the clerk. "This foreclosure was based on an administrative error, which the city failed to correct. Furthermore, my client was denied due process in his appeal." Cynthia's face paled. "That's nonsense." The lawyer turned to her, his gaze calm but sharp. "The city fast-tracked this foreclosure under questionable circumstances. Mr. Carter never defaulted on his taxes. If this auction proceeds, the county could be looking at a serious lawsuit." The auctioneer whispered hurriedly with the clerk. A tense minute passed. Then, "This auction is halted pending further review." The crowd erupted. Cheers, gasps, laughter. Sam clapped Jordan on the back, while Mrs. Patel wiped tears from her eyes. But Jordan wasn't celebrating yet. His gaze locked onto Cynthia. She looked furious. "You can't do this," she hissed at Harrington. "I know the mayor. I know people who—" "You know how to manipulate a broken system," Harrington interrupted smoothly. "But you made one mistake." Cynthia glared at him. "And what's that?" He smiled. "You underestimated the power of a community." Jordan finally let out a breath. He turned to the house that was still his. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't afraid. He had won, not just because of the law, but because he had never fought alone. Jordan stood in front of his house, staring at it like he was seeing it for the first time. The paint still needed touching up, the porch steps creaked underfoot, and the roof had a few spots that could use reinforcement. But it was his. The crowd from the courthouse had followed him home, still riding the wave of victory. Neighbors, friends, even people he hadn't spoken to much before. They were here standing with him because this had been more than just a fight for a house. It had been a fight for justice. Sam clapped him on the back. "Man, I don't know about you, but I could go for a beer." Laughter rippled through the group. Mrs. Patel shook her head with a smile. "We'll celebrate properly. Everyone, come to my house tomorrow. Big dinner, no arguments." Jordan couldn't help but grin. A week ago, he had felt like the world was closing in. Now, he was surrounded by people who had refused to let him fall. But there was one person missing from the celebration. Cynthia Whitmore stood across the street, arms folded, her mouth set in a thin, furious line. She wasn't gloating now. The power she had wielded so effortlessly over Jordan's life had been stripped away in a matter of minutes. For the first time, she had lost. Jordan met her gaze. He could have said something, could have rubbed it in, but he didn't, because this wasn't about her anymore. Instead, he turned to the people around him, the ones who had lifted him when he had nearly fallen. "Thank you," he said, voice thick with emotion. "I don't even know how to begin to repay you all." Mrs. Patel patted his arm. "Beta, you already did. You've been helping this neighborhood for years. We were just returning the favor." Sam smirked. "Yeah, don't get too emotional. Just remember this next time I need my sink fixed." Laughter erupted again, and Jordan chuckled, shaking his head. Then, a familiar voice spoke up from the side. "You could start by fixing your porch." Jordan turned, and there stood Mr. Alvarez, the retired carpenter who had given him extra work when he needed it most. Jordan grinned. "Guess I know what I'm doing tomorrow. A new beginning." The next morning, Jordan was up at sunrise, tools in hand. He wasn't fixing someone else's house this time. He was restoring his own. As he worked, people started showing up. Sam, Mr. Alvarez, a few neighbors who had seen the battle unfold. Even Mrs. Patel, bringing a tray of warm chai. Before long, it had turned into a full-blown neighborhood project. Some painted the porch railings. Others pulled weeds from the garden his mother had planted years ago. Someone even brought over fresh wood for the steps. And as Jordan worked, something in him shifted. He had spent years thinking that strength meant standing alone, that he had to handle everything himself, without asking for help. But now, as he looked around, at the people hammering nails, carrying supplies, laughing and working together, he realized that true strength wasn't about going it alone. It was about knowing when to lean on others. The lesson. By sunset, the house looked better than ever. The porch was freshly painted, the steps reinforced, and the garden, his mother's garden, bloomed once more. Jordan sat on the porch with Sam, both of them drinking beers, watching the neighborhood settle into the evening. "You know," Sam said, tipping his bottle toward the house, "your dad would be proud." Jordan exhaled, looking around. "Yeah," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I think he would." Sam smirked. "And you know what else?" "What?" "You owe me so many free repairs." Jordan laughed, shaking his head. Yeah, I got you." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jordan leaned back, feeling something he hadn't felt in weeks. Peace. His home was safe. His future was still uncertain, but he wasn't afraid anymore. Because now, he knew, no matter what came next, he wouldn't face it alone. 6 months later, Jordan stood on his newly rebuilt porch, watching the neighborhood wake up. His neighborhood. The house was more than just standing, it was thriving. The repairs had held strong, the paint still fresh, and his mother's garden, once on the verge of ruin, now bloomed with vibrant colors. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a testament to resilience, to community, to the power of standing together. Jordan had expanded his contracting business, thanks to the connections he'd built during his fight to save his home. He wasn't just fixing things anymore, he was giving back, offering fair work, helping families in tough spots, Making sure no one in the community ever felt as alone as he had that day, he found the foreclosure notice on his door. Cynthia Whitmore, once the queen of the block, had faded into the background. Her influence in the neighborhood had dwindled, and people no longer feared her whispers or manipulations. She had power once, but she had used it to tear people down. And now, no one was willing to stand beside her. Jordan took a deep breath, the morning air crisp and full of promise. He had fought, he had struggled, and in the end, he had won. Not just a house, but something greater. A future built on strength, love, and the unbreakable power of community.